I was described as a Rick Moranis type. So that just shows you what the writer's room was already doing. They're casting a black kid and asking for a Rick Moranis type. So
In the golden age of 90s television, few characters exploded onto the screen with the force of Steve Urkel. With his oversized glasses, high-pitched voice, and unforgettable catchphrase, "Did I do that?" he didn't just capture attention, he hijacked it. Week after week, America tuned in to Family Matters expecting a wholesome family sitcom, only to find the show morph into the Urkel Show. And while fans laughed at the antics of this quirky next-door neighbor, behind the scenes, Jaleel White, the man trapped inside that suspenders-wearing caricature, was living a reality far more complicated than audiences ever imagined. For years, Jaleel kept quiet about what really happened on the set, about how the role that made him famous also cornered him, and about the way the laughter on screen often hid the tension off it. But now, after decades of silence, he has begun peeling back the curtain on the truth he carried for so long. What was the cost of becoming Urkel? And why did Jaleel White say that the fame nearly destroyed him? Stay with us as we find out. When Family Matters premiered in 1989, it was designed to be a spin-off. The show wasn't meant to center around a nerdy neighbor, nor was it meant to revolve around slapstick comedy. It was supposed to tell the story of the Winslows, a working-class black family living in Chicago, led by Carl Winslow, the firm but loving police officer, and his wife Harriet, the backbone of the household. The tone was warm, family-oriented, and balanced between heartfelt lessons and light-hearted laughs. That was the plan, until a one-off guest star stole the spotlight. Jaleel White was just 12 years old when he auditioned for the role of Steve Urkel. Originally intended as a single-episode character, a goofy nerd who lived next door, Urkel wasn't supposed to last beyond his first appearance. But when that episode aired, something happened that no one could have predicted. The audience roared. The live studio crowd laughed louder than they had all season. Letters poured in, praising this strange little character with suspenders and oversized glasses. Suddenly, executives saw gold. Urkel was no longer a one-time joke. He was the show. For Jaleel White, that twist of fate was both a blessing and a curse. Overnight, he went from being a kid actor with a small role to the centerpiece of one of America's most popular sitcoms. The network leaned hard into Urkelmania, plastering his face on merchandise, lunchboxes, toys, and posters. He became a household name, rivaling cartoon characters in popularity. Children imitated his walk, his laugh, his famous phrase. Even celebrities couldn't resist the craze. Urkel appeared in commercials, crossover episodes, and even music videos. But behind the neon glow of fame, Jaleel's reality was far more complicated. He hadn't signed up to become Steve Urkel forever. He was an actor who wanted range, depth, and variety. Yet, as the seasons went on, he realized that the more Urkel appeared, the less space there was for the Winslow family. Slowly, the show about family became the show about Urkel. His co-stars, who had expected to carry the series, began to feel sidelined. The tension was palpable, though fans had no idea. Jaleel himself struggled with the sudden transformation of his life. At an age when most kids were going to middle school dances and worrying about homework, he was working grueling hours on set, rehearsing, filming, and living under the weight of a character the network demanded more of. What started as fun soon began to feel like a trap. Every success he had was tied to Urkel. Every laugh from the audience reminded him that they weren't laughing at Jaleel. They were laughing at the caricature he had created. The takeover of Urkel wasn't just felt in the scripts, it was in the ratings. By the second season, viewership had skyrocketed. NBC promoted the character relentlessly, using Urkel to save time slots and boost sagging lineups. Suddenly, the once secondary character was doing wacky science experiments, inventing gadgets, and even creating alter egos like Stefan Urkel, the suave version of himself. Each gimmick drew bigger numbers. Urkel was no longer just a nerdy kid. He was the entire show's identity. But this meteoric rise carried a shadow. Cast members whispered privately about the direction of the series. They had signed up for a family sitcom, but they were now co-stars in someone else's circus. Rumors circulated that some actors felt resentment, not toward Jaleel personally, but toward the imbalance the network had created. For a child actor like Jaleel, the pressure was immense. He was not just expected to carry scenes, but to carry the entire show. If an episode didn't land, it was his fault. If the ratings dipped, executives looked at him. What audiences never realized was that Jaleel White had become both the savior and the scapegoat of family matters. He was adored by fans but trapped by expectations. He was celebrated publicly, but privately, he wrestled with loneliness, pressure, and an identity crisis that would follow him for years. And while the world shouted, "Did I do that?" with laughter, Jaleel White was asking himself a very different question in the quiet of his own mind. What have I become? On screen, Steve Urkel was a phenomenon. His squeaky voice, clumsy antics, and over-the-top nerd persona made audiences laugh week after week. But behind the laughs was a sobering truth. Jaleel White was paying a price for embodying a stereotype that would cling to him long after the cameras stopped rolling. For Jaleel, the transformation into Steve Urkel was more than just putting on suspenders and glasses. It was stepping into a caricature that America couldn't look away from. As a young black actor in the 1990s, he had achieved what few others could: mainstream visibility on primetime television. But that visibility came at a cost, because the very thing that made him popular also boxed him in. Urkel wasn't just a character. He was a label, one that audiences, executives, and even casting directors could not separate from Jaleel White, the person. In interviews years later, Jaleel admitted the strain of living inside Urkel's skin. He was constantly reminded that the world didn't see him. It saw the nerd. Even when he walked into casting calls outside of Family Matters, producers couldn't take him seriously. He was typecast before he even had the chance to prove his range. Hollywood wasn't interested in Jaleel White, the actor. They only wanted Steve Urkel, the punchline. The stereotype cut deeper than professional frustrations. Jaleel spoke candidly about how it affected his self-esteem as a teenager. While other kids his age were trying to fit in, explore their identities, and discover who they wanted to become, he was stuck portraying the most exaggerated version of uncool. He couldn't escape it. At school, peers would mimic his voice, repeat his catchphrases, or mock his character. Even though he was famous and wealthy compared to his classmates, fame didn't shield him from ridicule. It amplified it. The pressure to keep the Urkel machine going also took a toll on his emotional well-being. Audiences didn't realize how much effort went into maintaining the character. The high-pitched voice strained his throat. The hunched posture was physically demanding, and the overacting required constant energy. Jaleel wasn't just being funny. He was working tirelessly to deliver performances that executives demanded, week after week. And because Urkel had become the center of the show, all eyes were on him. If he faltered, the entire production risked falling apart. What made it worse was the sense that he was playing into a stereotype that carried heavy cultural baggage. Urkel was the ultimate nerd, socially awkward, unfashionable, and bumbling. But in the context of being one of the few black leads on television at the time, the character walked a fine line. To some, he was groundbreaking, showing a black character who wasn't defined by toughness or street culture. But to others, he reinforced a new kind of limitation, one that reduced Jaleel's range to comic relief. Even as a teenager, Jaleel understood that Urkel was bigger than him. He often compared it to wearing a mask that everyone loved, but nobody cared about the person underneath. "You were just caught in a machine," he once reflected. "You couldn't really escape it." This machine chewed up his childhood and replaced it with a franchise that was more concerned with ratings than his well-being. The emotional toll grew heavier when Jaleel realized that his career was being defined too early. While other cast members were free to explore dramatic arcs or showcase nuanced performances, his scripts became increasingly wacky. Urkel was inventing teleportation machines, transforming into a cool alter ego named Stefan, and even cloning himself. The writers leaned into gimmicks because they worked, but those gimmicks also cemented Jaleel's identity as nothing more than the comic relief. Behind the scenes, Jaleel wrestled with resentment. He wanted to be seen as an actor with potential, not just a punchline machine. But as a child, his ability to push back was limited. The adults around him, executives, producers, even his own family, saw the immense financial opportunity. The show was a hit, and the character was marketable. Jaleel had little room to say no. Each time he stepped onto the set, he was reminded that the world didn't want Jaleel White. It wanted Urkel. That disconnect created cracks in his personal life. He admitted that his relationships outside of work were strained because people couldn't separate him from his character. Potential girlfriends saw him as the goofy nerd on TV. Strangers constantly demanded he perform the catchphrase in public, as though he were a puppet who existed solely for their entertainment. He described it as living in a box you can't break out of. And for a young man trying to define his identity, it was suffocating. But perhaps the deepest wound came from the lack of recognition for the skill behind the performance. To play Urkel convincingly required immense talent, comic timing, physicality, and vocal control. Yet instead of being praised for his craft, Jaleel was mocked for the character. The world treated Urkel as a joke, and by extension, treated Jaleel as one too. That sense of invisibility, being laughed at but not respected, haunted him. By the time the show reached its later seasons, Jaleel was carrying not only the weight of being the show's star, but also the burden of a stereotype he could not shake. Every laugh he earned came with a hidden cost. Every catchphrase repeated by fans was another reminder that he was trapped inside Urkel's shadow. And though he smiled for the cameras, inside, he longed for the day he could finally be free. Little did fans know, that day would come, but it wouldn't come easily. The tensions on set were building, and as Urkel's popularity soared, cracks in the cast's relationships began to show. The family sitcom was no longer the same. And when those tensions boiled over, Jaleel White would find himself at the center of a storm that nearly broke him. At its core, Family Matters was never meant to be about Steve Urkel. When the show first aired in 1989, it was built as a spin-off of Perfect Strangers, focusing on the Winslow family, a working-class black family living in Chicago. The early storylines revolved around Carl Winslow, his wife Harriet, their children, and extended relatives navigating relatable ups and downs. The idea was simple, a wholesome family comedy with life lessons and laughs. But everything changed the moment Jaleel White walked on set. Steve Urkel wasn't even supposed to last beyond one episode. He was introduced as a quirky neighbor who existed for a quick gag, just enough to stir things up in a single storyline. But the response from the live studio audience was explosive. Urkel's clumsy charm, nasal voice, and awkward devotion to Laura Winslow sparked hysterical laughter that producers couldn't ignore. Practically overnight, a minor side character became the centerpiece of the entire series. and that sudden shift planted the seeds of tension. For the Winslow family cast, it felt like the show they had signed up for was being rewritten before their eyes. Jo Marie Payton, who played Harriet Winslow, was particularly vocal about the changes. She had been the anchor of the series in its early seasons, carrying the heart of the show as a strong mother figure. But as Urkel fever spread, scripts began to lean less on her and more on the young actor in suspenders. What had once been an ensemble family comedy was quickly morphing into The Steve Urkel Show. Reginald VelJohnson, who played Carl Winslow, experienced a similar shift. Initially billed as the fatherly lead, his character was often reduced to a foil for Urkel's antics, reacting to explosions, inventions gone wrong, or awkward situations caused by his nerdy neighbor. The serious storylines about fatherhood, marriage, and working as a cop took a back seat to slapstick comedy. For a seasoned actor like VelJohnson, it was frustrating to watch his role shrink while Urkel's influence ballooned. Jaleel, meanwhile, was caught in a storm he hadn't created. He was still a teenager, but suddenly he was carrying the weight of the entire show. While his fellow castmates were resentful of the spotlight he commanded, Jaleel felt isolated. He wanted to be part of the team, not the center of unwanted tension. Yet each week, as audience demand for more Urkel grew louder, the scripts reflected it. Whether it was, "Did I do that?" catchphrases, or increasingly absurd sci-fi inventions, Urkel was the moneymaker. The showrunners weren't about to ignore ratings gold, but popularity came with consequences. Behind the scenes, cracks began to appear in the family dynamic. Payton would later admit in interviews that she struggled with how much the show revolved around Urkel, feeling as though her character's depth was sacrificed for cheap laughs. There were even reports of heated arguments on set between her and producers, with Jaleel often caught in the middle. For Jaleel, the tension wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. He respected his older castmates and looked up to them, but he couldn't control the fact that his character had become the star. In interviews years later, he recalled moments of hostility, where he felt excluded or resented simply for doing his job well. He described the environment as cold at times, a far cry from the warm family image the show projected on screen. As the seasons went on, the divide only grew wider. Urkel's popularity led to increasingly outlandish storylines, time machines, transformation chambers, and even turning into his suave alter ego, Stefan Urkelli. While audiences lapped it up, many cast members privately felt the show had lost its original heart. What was supposed to be a sitcom about a black family navigating real-life struggles had turned into a weekly cartoon, driven by one character's wackiness. It wasn't just the adult cast who felt sidelined. The younger actors, including those who played the Winslow children, also saw their roles shrink. Characters were written out without explanation, story arcs were abandoned, and the family dynamic was overshadowed by Urkel's endless antics. Jimmy Foxworth, who played Judy Winslow, famously disappeared from the show altogether, her character written off without even a goodbye scene. Many fans never realized it, but behind that decision was the same driving force. The writers no longer needed her because Urkel was the star. For audiences, the laughter masked the reality of what was happening behind the cameras. Fans saw a quirky, lovable nerd making people laugh every Friday night. But on set, there were unspoken tensions, resentments, and quiet frustrations that never made it to air. Jaleel bore the brunt of it, carrying not only the responsibility of being the breakout star, but also the weight of strained relationships with people he admired. The irony is that Jaleel himself didn't want to overshadow anyone. He wanted to be part of the family dynamic, not the sole reason people tuned in. But in Hollywood, ratings speak louder than relationships. Producers and networks were ruthless in chasing what worked, and Urkel worked better than anyone expected. That left Jaleel stuck in a role that brought him fame and fortune while simultaneously isolating him from his own cast family. By the show's later years, the tension had taken its toll. Jo Marie Payton would eventually leave the series, frustrated by what she saw as creative misdirection. Other cast members voiced similar concerns after the show ended, though often more discreetly. And through it all, Jaleel carried the burden of being both the show's savior and its source of conflict. When Jaleel finally opened up years later about those experiences, he didn't shy away from acknowledging the pain. He described feeling like an outsider on his own show, even as audiences adored him. The image of family that Family Matters sold to the world was far from the reality on set. For Jaleel, the hardest truth was realizing that success had come at the cost of belonging. And yet, the storm was only beginning. Because while cast tensions made life difficult, Jaleel's greatest battles were not with his colleagues, but with himself. The weight of playing Urkel, the pressure to perform, and the struggle to break free from a role that defined him would push him into some of the darkest chapters of his life. On screen, Jaleel White was America's favorite nerd. He was the clumsy genius, the lovesick boy next door, the source of endless laughter. To the millions of families who tuned in every Friday night, he was Steve Urkel, the kid who made mistakes, cracked jokes, and always found redemption in the end. But away from the cameras, Jaleel was fighting battles that no one in the audience ever saw. The first struggle was identity. Jaleel was a talented young actor with dreams of a long, versatile career. But the runaway success of Steve Urkel meant that every time casting directors looked at him, they didn't see Jaleel White the actor. They saw Urkel, the suspenders, the glasses, the high-pitched voice. That character became a mask he couldn't remove, even when he desperately wanted to. And for a teenager trying to grow up in the public eye, the inability to separate himself from a fictional persona became suffocating. Jaleel later admitted that he felt trapped. The catchphrases, the pratfalls, the nerdy quirks, they weren't him. They were a performance, crafted to entertain millions. But when the cameras stopped rolling, strangers treated him like Urkel was real. They called out his lines in public, laughed at his mannerisms, and expected him to always be that goofy neighbor. The line between who he was and who the world thought he was blurred to the point of breaking. Adding to that pressure was the isolation he often felt on set. While Family Matters was marketed as a wholesome family series, Jaleel sometimes felt like anything but part of a family. The cast tensions created a chill behind the scenes, and as a teenager, he had few places to turn. He couldn't fully confide in his co-stars, and he couldn't escape the demanding expectations of the producers. His world became one of loneliness, hidden behind the curtain of laughter and applause. His parents played a big role in his life, managing his career and trying to protect him. But, as with many child stars, that involvement also blurred boundaries. Jaleel should have been focused on school, friendships, and discovering who he was outside of work. Instead, every decision carried the weight of a career, contracts, negotiations, and the unrelenting demand to stay in character. Even when he wasn't filming, he was often working, rehearsing, or being paraded in public appearances as Urkel. Childhood slipped away under the bright lights of Hollywood. Then came the pressure of perfection. Jaleel wasn't just any actor, he was the ratings magnet. Networks leaned on him to carry the show. Entire seasons revolved around Urkel's antics. Every script seemed to ask more of him, and every episode had to live up to the audience's expectations. For a teenager, that responsibility was crushing. He couldn't afford to have an off day, a bad take, or a quiet moment of self-doubt. The machine demanded he be Urkel 24/7. The toll began to show. In interviews years later, Jaleel confessed to breaking down emotionally during the show's run. The weight of being trapped in a role, the tensions with castmates, and the constant public scrutiny were too much for someone his age to bear. He even admitted that he once cried while being dressed in costume, overcome with the realization that people no longer saw him. They only saw Urkel. And the struggle didn't end when the cameras turned off. Outside of the studio, Jaleel had to deal with fame in its most invasive form. Wherever he went, fans recognized him instantly. But instead of treating him like a normal young man, they expected Urkel. Strangers mocked his voice, demanded he perform catchphrases, or laughed at him as though he were still a clown on set. It robbed him of dignity, making it nearly impossible to simply exist as Jaleel White. The darker side of child stardom haunted him as well. Hollywood is littered with young actors who succumb to the pressures of fame, struggling with identity, depression, and a lack of control over their own lives. Jaleel managed to avoid some of the most destructive pitfalls, but that doesn't mean he was unscathed. The weight of his experiences left scars that would shape his adulthood. He also faced the harsh reality of typecasting. Once Family Matters ended, Jaleel thought he would move on to new opportunities. But casting directors didn't want Jaleel White, the actor. They wanted Urkel. Offers dried up and doors closed. For years, he struggled to prove that he was more than the nerd in suspenders. Every audition felt like an uphill battle against a ghost that wouldn't die. Worse, the entertainment industry wasn't kind to young black actors once their shows ended. While some child stars were able to transition smoothly into adult roles, Jaleel found himself caught in a double bind, trapped not only by Urkel's shadow, but also by Hollywood's limited imagination when it came to black talent. He wasn't given the same chances to reinvent himself as other actors, leaving him frustrated and overlooked. Even in his personal life, the effects lingered. Relationships were difficult when everyone saw him as Urkel first. Friends, colleagues, even romantic partners often carried preconceived notions of who he was supposed to be. And as much as he tried to break free, the stigma followed him into adulthood. The pain of not being truly seen, of being defined by a character rather than by his own humanity, was a wound that took years to heal. But perhaps the greatest struggle was internal. Jaleel later admitted that he often questioned his own worth. Was he talented beyond Urkel? Did he matter outside of that role? Could he ever build a career as Jaleel White? Or would he forever be chained to a single catchphrase? These questions gnawed at him for decades, shaping the way he approached his craft and his life. To the world, Jaleel White was a star. To himself, he was often a prisoner of the very role that made him famous. It's a story as old as Hollywood itself, the child actor adored by millions, yet silently unraveling under the weight of expectations. And for Jaleel, that battle was far from over. Because while the world laughed with Urkel, Jaleel was fighting to reclaim his identity from the character who had stolen it. The reality was clear. Behind every "Did I do that?" was a young man silently asking, "Who am I really?" When Family Matters finally ended in 1998, most fans assumed Jaleel White would seamlessly step into the next big role. After all, he wasn't just a sitcom star, he was the face of a cultural phenomenon. Steve Urkel had become a household name across America, and Jaleel had carried the weight of an entire show on his teenage shoulders. But when the lights dimmed and the curtain fell, he faced a sobering truth. Escaping Urkel's shadow would be the hardest role of his life. The first years after the sitcom were filled with rejection. Casting directors couldn't see beyond the suspenders and squeaky voice. Every audition felt like déjà vu, rooms full of industry insiders smirking, unable to shake the image of Urkel bumbling across their TV screens. Jaleel could deliver a dramatic monologue with raw emotion, but at the end of it, someone would inevitably chuckle and say, "Can you do the Urkel voice?" It wasn't admiration, it was a cage. This typecasting haunted him. Hollywood has always been brutal to child stars, but in Jaleel's case, the situation was even worse. Urkel wasn't just a character. He was a cultural icon, permanently etched into the American consciousness. And no matter how much Jaleel wanted to move forward, the industry kept dragging him back into the past. It was as if his greatest achievement had also become his greatest curse. Determined not to let his career fade, Jaleel turned to education and self-reinvention. Unlike many young stars who spiraled after the spotlight dimmed, he went to UCLA, earning a degree in film and television. It was a bold move, signaling that he wasn't going to rely on nostalgia or recycled fame. He wanted to learn the craft, to prove he had the skill and intelligence to survive in Hollywood on his own terms. But reinvention doesn't happen overnight. For years, Jaleel took smaller roles, voice acting gigs, and guest appearances on TV shows. Fans might have caught glimpses of him in Dreamgirls, Boston Legal, or even voice work for Sonic the Hedgehog. Each role was a step forward, but none allowed him to fully shed the Urkel image. Even in projects where he didn't wear suspenders or speak in a high-pitched squeak, audiences still whispered, "That's Urkel." And yet, Jaleel refused to surrender. Unlike other child stars who were consumed by their roles, he fought back. He leaned into writing, producing, and creating his own material. By stepping behind the camera, he began taking control of his narrative. He didn't just want to act, he wanted to build stories that showcased his true range. Slowly but surely, he was carving out a place for himself that no one could take away. But the journey wasn't just about work. It was also about reclaiming his personal life. As he grew older, Jaleel wrestled with the same struggles many child actors face: identity, trust, and purpose. He once admitted that relationships were difficult because women often approached him with preconceived notions. Was he the nerdy Urkel, or was he Stefan Urkele, the cool alter ego the show introduced to broaden his appeal? That constant comparison to fictional versions of himself made it nearly impossible for him to simply be Jaleel White. Despite the obstacles, one of Jaleel's biggest breakthroughs came in 2010, when he starred in Who Made the Potato Salad, and later in independent projects where he could showcase his comedic and dramatic chops without the trappings of Urkel. These roles might not have been blockbuster hits, but they allowed him to remind both audiences and himself that he was more than one character. Then, in 2012, he appeared on Dancing with the Stars. It was a risky move. Reality TV has a way of pigeonholing celebrities even further. But for Jaleel, it was a chance to reintroduce himself to America. This time, he wasn't hiding behind suspenders or glasses. He was Jaleel White, confident, charming, and determined. The show gave him visibility and a platform to show fans a side of himself they hadn't seen before. Still, the shadow of Urkel lingered. Whenever his name popped up in the media, it was almost always tied to that one role. But instead of running from it, Jaleel began to embrace the complicated truth. Urkel was a part of him, but not the whole story. He started opening up in interviews about the struggles he endured and the lessons he learned. By owning his past, he was finally beginning to free himself from it. His persistence paid off in 2021 when he announced a surprising venture: his own cannabis brand, It's Purple. The news shocked fans who had only known him as the squeaky-voiced nerd, but for Jaleel, it was the ultimate statement of independence. He wasn't waiting for Hollywood to define him anymore. He was building his own empire, using his fame as leverage rather than a chain. And perhaps the most powerful part of Jaleel's journey is his resilience. He watched many of his fellow child stars fall victim to addiction, scandal, and the cruelty of an industry that chews kids up and spits them out. Yet through it all, he survived. He stumbled, yes, but he never let the story end with just Urkel. Instead, he turned his struggles into fuel, proving that he could outlast the limitations placed on him. Breaking free wasn't about erasing the past. It was about rewriting his future. Jaleel White may always be remembered as Steve Urkel, but by carving out his own path, he's shown the world that he is more than a character, more than a catchphrase, and more than a stereotype. He is an artist, a businessman, and a survivor. And yet, even after decades of struggle, one final chapter remained. The truth Jaleel White would eventually share. A revelation that forced fans to confront what Family Matters really meant behind the laughter. For years, Jaleel White stayed silent about the truth of Family Matters. He did interviews, yes, but they were safe, rehearsed, and polite. He smiled when asked about Urkel. He joked about the suspenders and the high-pitched voice. He even leaned into nostalgia when the cameras demanded it. But behind the grin was a young man who had carried far more than audiences ever realized. And when he finally opened up, what he revealed forever changed the way fans saw both him and the show that made him famous. In a 2021 interview with TV1's Uncensored, Jaleel tore away the polite veneer and let the world glimpse his reality. For the first time, he admitted that the weight of playing Urkel wasn't just exhausting, it was traumatizing. He spoke of being ostracized, not only by Hollywood, but also by some members of the very cast he had worked with for nearly a decade. While fans assumed the Family Matters set was as warm as the Winslow household, Jaleel painted a far darker picture. He revealed that his sudden rise to stardom as Urkel had created resentment. Cast members who had signed on expecting the show to focus on Reginald VelJohnson and the Winslow family were blindsided when the nerdy neighbor, originally intended for just one appearance, became the central attraction. The writers bent storylines to accommodate Urkel. Merchandise flooded stores. Catchphrases filled pop culture. And while audiences cheered, behind the scenes, tension simmered. Jaleel admitted that as a child actor, he didn't have the maturity to understand the jealousy, the politics, or the unspoken anger aimed his way. He only knew that when the cameras weren't rolling, the warmth wasn't always there. There was a division, he confessed, and I felt it every single day. For a teenager thrust into sudden fame, that kind of isolation was devastating. But perhaps the most shocking part of Jaleel's revelation was his admission about how much pressure he was under, not just to perform, but to protect an image. He recalled moments where he was treated like a commodity rather than a human being, forced to maintain a smile even when his heart was breaking. Producers saw him as ratings gold, but rarely as a child who needed support. Behind the oversized glasses, he was just a boy trying to survive an industry that had no mercy. In one particularly raw moment, Jaleel spoke about the emotional breakdowns he experienced while filming. The pressure to keep the show alive rested heavily on his shoulders, even though he was barely a teenager. Audiences at home laughed when he turned into Stefan Urkel, the smooth, cool alter ego of Urkel. But Jaleel remembered those scenes differently. To him, Stefan wasn't just a character. It was an escape, a chance to shed the nerdy costume and finally be seen as something more. And yet, even then, the audience still demanded Urkel. Always Urkel. The pain didn't end with the show's cancellation. Jaleel admitted that the typecasting followed him into adulthood, gnawing away at his confidence. He recalled one casting director bluntly telling him, "We don't know how to use you without Urkel." The words stung, a reminder that his talent was invisible, overshadowed by a character he never intended to play long-term. And yet, through the bitterness and hurt, Jaleel's truth carried another layer: gratitude. He acknowledged that without Urkel, he wouldn't have had a career. Without Family Matters, he wouldn't have made history as one of the first black nerds on television. A character who, for all his quirks, broke stereotypes and gave audiences someone they hadn't seen before. Jaleel finally admitted he had a complicated relationship with Urkel. He both resented him and respected him. He hated the chains, but cherished the legacy. What made his revelation so powerful was the honesty. For decades, fans assumed Jaleel White was living the dream, basking in the glory of his childhood fame. But when he finally told the truth, they realized it had been a battle. He had carried the weight of resentment, the scars of isolation, and the sting of being typecast. And yet, he had survived. His confession also forced fans to reconsider the world of sitcoms in the 1990s. Family Matters looked wholesome on screen, but behind the laughter, there were politics, power struggles, and wounded egos. It was a reminder that television isn't just entertainment, it's a business. And in that business, even a child could be treated as a tool. When asked if he would ever reprise the role of Urkel, Jaleel gave an answer that revealed both closure and defiance. He said he had no interest in stepping back into the suspenders. That chapter of his life was over. "I've done what I had to do," he said firmly. "It's time for the world to see me as Jaleel White." The revelation was bittersweet. Fans who adored Urkel were heartbroken to hear how much pain was hidden behind the laugh track. But at the same time, they admired Jaleel for finally telling his truth. He had carried the burden for too long, and by speaking out, he not only freed himself, but also gave other child stars the courage to acknowledge their own struggles. In the end, Jaleel's story wasn't just about typecasting or resentment, it was about resilience. He had been written off, underestimated, and overshadowed, but he never gave up. He learned to embrace the complicated legacy of Urkel while carving out his own identity. And in telling the truth, he gave fans a final, powerful gift: the real story behind the laughter. Because behind every sitcom smile is a story no one notices, until the person brave enough to live it finally decides to speak. Jaleel White's journey proves that fame often hides a harsher reality. Behind Urkel's laugh was a boy carrying unimaginable weight, and behind Jaleel's smile was a truth the world never saw. What do you think of his revelations? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories.